Hello everyone, in today's video I will be showing you how to paint this beautiful beach cove in Mallorca, Spain. I've got a trip coming up to Mallorca, so I've been practicing compositions and color schemes and came across this image for us to use as a reference. I did prepare this practice piece ahead of time, which I did on inexpensive watercolor paper, that paper being the Canson XL, which is a cellulose paper. Yes, working on really good paper will indeed make your artistic endeavors a lot easier. However, I am a big proponent of learning to work on budget paper because it will help you learn all the watercolor techniques to the absolute best of your ability due to the challenges you will inevitably encounter. Now, up until this point in almost all of my videos, I have been practicing what I preach and have been using sketchbooks and papers that are nothing but cellulose. For today's video, however, I decided to pull out my professional watercolor paper, La Creme de la Creme Arches, Arches cold press fine grain 100% cotton watercolor paper, because I'll be throwing a lot into this piece and the cotton paper will actually allow me to do that and will of course yield a better result. Plus, this will be something I can then put up for sale later if I'm happy with the result, of course. So normally when working on a strictly watercolor piece such as this, I do have a tabletop easel that I like to use in order to work at a consistent angle. But after setting up my filming equipment, I found that I did not actually have enough space left for my easel. So I ended up taping my paper to a smaller cutting mat instead. Hindsight being 2020, I do not recommend using a cutting mat because it ended up being too flexible. A firmer surface would have been better. Anyway, for drawing, I'm using a Faber-Castell sketching pencil in 2B, which over time I have found is soft enough to not damage the paper, but also firm enough to not smudge too badly. I've started drawing with my first mark being the horizon line. The horizon line will always be at eye level. Once that's in the right location, I then move on to the other elements of the scene. I'm keeping the details to a minimum because I want the watercolor to do the work. You can see that I'm holding my pencil very loosely. Don't ever press hard into the paper with a sharp point. You'll damage the paper. The pencil right now has a very sharp point, so I'm sketching very lightly. I hope you can still see it. Basically drawing marks and squiggles to show myself where to put rocks and where to put trees and foliage, using the reference image as a guide. The reference image, along with all the materials, will be linked down below in the description box. I was halfway through drawing the bottom portion here before I realized I wasn't in frame, and so I'm moving my mat up so you can see it better, hopefully. Now I'm drawing the rocks that are near the shoreline. I'm also drawing the lines that show where the water ends and where the sandy beach begins. At this point, all the major components have been added, and I'm now just drawing some guidelines to show where I will need to place some shading with the watercolors. My main brush for this is going to be my Princeton Neptune in size 12. It is a wonderfully versatile brush. It holds water and pigment really well while still maintaining a beautiful tip. The first thing I'm going to do is wet the entire paper above the horizon line, making sure to put enough water on there so that the paper will retain the moisture for a good amount of time. You're going to put water on there however many times you need to until you get a nice even sheen on the paper. It's okay if your water ends up going a bit below the horizon line. Now that I'm ready for the color, I'm lifting up my mat so that I can apply the color at an angle. The purpose being I want my colors to run down, not up. I'm starting with cerulean blue. I'm then adding some dioxazine purple. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that color correctly. I'm now applying ultramarine to the top of the sky and a little bit here and there just above the violet. I am using Winsor & Newton Cotman colors. While my paper is still wet, I'm adding a mix of lemon yellow hue and sap green. I'm still holding my mat up so that the color doesn't bleed too far up into the sky. I'm then adding some cerulean blue to random areas on the right side there where I'll be adding some trees, but the blue is going to end up disappearing later though, that's fine. My paper is still pretty damp, so I'm now adding some Hooker's Green light to the areas that will eventually be the darker areas of the trees. I'm letting the colors mix on the paper. I've now added a mix of Hooker's Green Dark and Indigo, and I'm adding it to some areas of the Hooker's Green Light. I'm adding more touches of indigo because it's all going to dry a lot lighter than what I'm putting down. That's just the nature of watercolors. By the way, the indigo I'm using is the professional version from Winsor & Newton. I ran out of my Cotman indigo ages ago and replaced it with the professional since I already had that one. For the rocks in the distance, I'm adding yellow ochre. Normally, I would use quinacridone gold, but Cotman doesn't have that, so yellow ochre works fine too. I'm only using the tip of my brush. My paper is still damp, so now I'm adding burnt sienna over some of the areas of yellow ochre. I love this color. Cotman has a beautiful burnt sienna. I'm adding just a little bit of a more concentrated burnt sienna, so there's less water in it. The color is spreading quite a bit, but I'm leaving it like that. Sometimes you just have to let watercolors do what they want to do. That's part of the beauty of this medium. Now you want to let that dry naturally. Unless you're pressed for time, I recommend you let this dry naturally so that you don't end up with harsh marks anywhere. Once that's dry, I move on to the rocks on the left. Using yellow ochre again, I'm making random vertical marks, making sure to leave plenty of empty spaces in between for natural highlights. In the reference image, there is quite a lot of brightness on the left-hand side and in the distance as well. I'm adding burnt sienna again to random areas of the yellow ochre. Once that's mostly dry, but not all the way dry, I'm then adding a little bit of sepia so that it won't spread too far. Going back to my lemon yellow hue and sap green mixture, I'm working on the foliage on the left-hand side. I'm putting Hooker's Green Light on top in some areas, trying not to cover up my lighter value too much. Then I'm adding that Hooker's Green Dark and Indigo mix from earlier. And I'm going to put a touch of just indigo here and there for the darker areas. Now for the right side, I'm going to be more deliberate and I'm going to work with more care because that side is in shadow with the sunlight clearly behind it. So I'm starting by wetting the entire area with clean water. Again, you want it to have a nice, even sheen. Starting with the rocks, using yellow ochre, I'm painting random marks, trying to leave white areas for highlights. I'm adding a little bit of burnt sienna here and there. I'm also adding some sepia just like before. Then I'm adding only sepia to some of the areas I left white. For all the foliage on the right side here, I'm just doing the same exact thing that I did on the left side. Also trying not to completely bury the lighter colors underneath. Okay, so at this point I used masking fluid to preserve the waves in the shoreline, but unfortunately, I didn't notice until I was all done with it that my camera didn't record any of it. Plus, I was out of frame anyway, I think. Here I'm just showing you what I used, which is a masking fluid pen from Schminke. This is a good one. You use it exactly like a pen, so all I did was just draw out what's supposed to be the ocean foam at the shoreline. When closing this pen, make sure you twist it until it clicks. You can't hear it click, but you can certainly feel it click. Otherwise, it will dry out. When working with masking fluid, you want to make sure that it's completely dry before you start painting over it. I'm preparing a mix of turquoise with a touch of emerald green to brighten it up. Emerald green already has a blue tone to it, so it works really well to brighten up the turquoise. The common turquoise is a little bit too much on the blue side. That's just my own opinion. So I always end up mixing a little bit of green into it. I'm putting that color on the paper wet on dry. It's hard to tell in the video, but I've got it pretty wet. And I'm spreading that color down to about halfway. I'm then taking some pure turquoise and I'm adding that to the horizon line, making sure to create some irregularities so that the bottom of the cliff in the back there doesn't end up looking like just a straight line. I'm then taking some clean water and using that to spread the color further down. My brush is only slightly damp, not wet, because as I work my way down, the brush will start to dry out, and that will help me create random white streaks as I get closer to the shoreline. This will help to simulate the white of the sea foam and the sparkles in the water. My ocean area is drying out too quickly, so I'm taking a fine mister, which releases water more softly and more evenly than a regular spray bottle. I'm using that to re-wet my paper so that I can work longer in this area. Don't be afraid to just spray your paper. Sometimes you need to work longer, and this is the only way to do that. I'm using my mostly dry brush to spread out the moisture a little bit more. I've also lifted up my mat again so that the water spreads downwards. I've grabbed a little bit of pure turquoise again and I'm adding it to the areas where the water has the shadows. Now I've grabbed indigo and I'm continuing to build up the shadows in the water. It's around this point that I'm starting to regret using blue masking fluid because it's starting to blend in with the water. I'm using the mister again to re-wet this area, except that this time I'm using the wetness to soften up the edges of the darker colors I just added. Since the paper is still nice and damp, I went back in with indigo to darken up the shadows again, but only near the edges. All right, while all that is drying, I'm moving down to the sandy beach area on the bottom left, and I'm wetting that whole little area with clean water. I'm then adding some burnt umber, very watered down, and while that's still wet, I'm adding a more saturated burnt umber. With my brush clean and dry, I'm lifting some of that color right back up to represent the movement of the tide that's visible in the reference image. And from there, I'm just doing the same thing on the right side that I just did on the left side. I'm also adding some of the watered down burnt umber to the area above the masking fluid to show that this area of the water is shallower. It will help make our ocean beach look more realistic. Then I decided to lift up some of the color in the upper center of the water just to add some texture and movement to the water, as well as sparkles from the sun. Going back to the upper left side, I've grabbed some Hooker's Green Dark and I'm adding leaves and foliage, just doing random little taps here and there with the tip of my brush. It's all a bit watery, so it will end up drying a little bit lighter than how it looks now, so don't worry about it looking too dark at this point. I've also added a little bit of indigo. With some sepia, I'm now starting to add the details of the rock formation on this little cliff. I'm adding it wherever I see the slightest hint of shadow to indicate where all these little cracks and shadows are in the reference image. I'm also using sepia to add the shadows at the bottom of the cliff where the rock meets the water. I'm then cleaning my brush, and while it's just a little bit damp, I'm lifting some color to show the reflection of the cliff in the water. Everything I did on the left side, I'm now repeating on the right side. Okay, now I'm taking some Hooker's Green Dark, very watered down, and I'm grabbing a little bit of that with my brush and I'm putting it over the bottom of the cliff as well as in the water where the rock meets the water. And I'm doing a glazing effect so that I'm not actually covering up the color that's there. I'm just glazing it, putting this light tint over it. Because in the reference image, it looks like, there's a bit of moss or something like that growing on the rocks and it's being reflected in the water. I then decided to extend the lighter color of my trees on the right side, and I'm doing that by just adding a mix of lemon yellow hue and sap green and just using a very light touch of that. So I just grabbed a little bit of it with my brush and I'm painting it upwards a little bit so that it doesn't look too harsh up against the sky. And at this point, I'm just building up my values, just adding more texture by painting more leaves and more foliage, and just making sure that these contrasts between light and dark are visible to help this area look more and more realistic as I work through it. All right, now that I'm pretty satisfied with the right side there, I'm going back to the left side and I'm adding just a little bit of yellow ochre, again, a sort of glazing effect to represent the reflections. Since yellow ochre is a semi-opaque color, I ended up having to go back in with the sepia and just re-add it to the bottom of the cliff there where the rock meets the water, so that I don't lose that little shadow that I had added there from earlier. And I'm using my finger just to brush it over the edge to soften the edge of the sepia. I am now finally switching brushes. This one is a Princeton Heritage in a size 2. It's not a very thirsty brush, so it's perfect for the finer little details that I'm going to be adding now. I'm grabbing just a pure sepia, very, very honey textured. It's very thick because I want to paint these tree trunks on the trees. And since I'm working in an area that's already pretty dark, then I need that tree trunk color to be dark as well, which is why I'm just going with a pure thick sepia in order for it to be visible. And I'm adding another little tree trunk to the left-hand tree. And now I'm ready to work on the bottom portion of this image, but in order to do that, I need to remove the masking fluid. To remove masking fluid, you need this, it's kind of like an eraser. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's rubbery. And it's specifically for removing masking fluid. You could use a cloth or a regular eraser, but I find that this tool works very well. It's meant for it, so it works well. And I haven't found that it damages the paper in any way, so I have it, I use it. I'll link it down below if you're interested. Now we're gonna have some fun with texture. A quick and easy way to add texture is by using a sponge. The best one to use is going to be a natural sponge. You can find it in any art store. You can even find it in any regular store. I think this is just like an inexpensive one that I found at Walmart, I think, actually. So you could get these anywhere. I've prepared on the side a mix of, again, lemon yellow hue with sap green, very watered down. And I'm just dipping the sponge in it and just making random marks all along the bottom there where this foreground foliage is situated. And that's just the sponge is gonna help cover this area quickly. I've also grabbed here some Hooker's Green Light, I believe, and I'm just doing the same thing and putting these colors right on top of each other because the effect is gonna be random, so it doesn't really, you can't go wrong with it, basically. I've grabbed my size 12 brush again, and I'm preparing a mixture of Hooker's Green Dark with indigo, and I'm just making random marks all along the bottom here. Very similar to what I did at the top with the other tree areas and foliage areas, just random marks. It doesn't really matter how you do it because the effect that we're going for here is just texture, and whatever way that you can to add that, just do it. Have fun with it. You can't really go wrong with it. Just have fun with it. Add color. You can see here how I'm using the same size 12 brush because it has a wonderful tip. And I'm just using that to make these random loose vertical strokes. It kind of looks like grass. In the reference image, I think it's like evergreen trees or something like that. But, you know, we're just having fun with this part. We're making it our own. And so I'm just making these vertical strokes, making it all random, and just building it up, building up the color values and building up the different textures. And part of adding texture is by varying your strokes. So I'm using different brush strokes to create different effects to make this foreground area stand out more and to make it more interesting since it's right in the front. Then I decided that we're just gonna splatter some paint on this area. Why not? So I'm covering the rest of the painting so that I don't get splatters anywhere else. Because all the years that I've been splattering paint, I still can't get it to just stay in the one area where I'm splattering. So I cover up the areas that I don't want to ruin. And I'm just grabbing some of the Hooker's green from earlier, whatever, the leftover paints that are in the palette. I'm grabbing the green. I'm going to be grabbing the indigo in a moment, just splattering it, again for texture. You can also put salt on it if you want. The salt is going to add very interesting texture on there. I just didn't have time to wait for the salt to dry out and then brush it off and everything, so I didn't use the salt. You can also sprinkle clean water on it. We're going for texture. That's all this section is about. Look at how neat that looks already. And so now I've let it dry naturally, and I'm preparing a mixture of turquoise, and I'm just mixing it into the green that was on the palette there already. So that's going to be turquoise with green, and I'm adding just a tiny bit of Payne's gray, and I'm watering it down significantly because I want to work on the rocks that are in the water. Now at this point, because I threw so much blue into the water there, I don't see my rock sketches anymore. My pencil sketch has disappeared. I don't know where I drew those rocks. So I'm just looking at the reference image and I'm eyeballing it. The way that I'm painting these rocks in is that I'm grabbing that paint mixture that I just prepared and I'm painting the upper rock edge. What looks to be the upper rock edge. I'm painting that in, and then I'm taking some clean water. You could even do it with the dirty water. It doesn't matter at this point. But just take some water and soften the bottom edge of what you just put down. And then I'm grabbing a tiny bit of Payne's gray and putting it right along the upper edge. And because that paint that I put down is still damp, it's not very wet, but it's still damp, that Payne's gray is going to slowly spread downward. And so that's how you get this effect of the rock looking like it's partially out and partially under the water. You just have to soften the bottom edge and add a little bit of contrast to the top, and then you get your rocks. It's as simple as that. It might take a little practice, but you can do it. It's not too hard. Now I'm adding some water to the leftover burnt umber and sepia that I have on the palette there. And I'm watering it down a lot in order to add little marks here and there in the white areas that were left behind from the masking fluid, because these are our little waves, our little frothy areas in the water, and we don't want them to be just stark white, because then it looks really fake. It just looks like this white thing, right? And so we're putting a little bit of color, little dabs of color, just to show that the water is coming over the sand. Again, it helps with the realism. And I'm also grabbing some of that leftover mix from earlier, the turquoise and green and Payne's gray, and I'm adding little dabs of that just a little bit further back into the watery areas, the white areas that are a little bit further back behind the rocks. I've now come back to the foreground area and I'm adding indigo. I'm just adding some kind of grassy strokes with the indigo in random areas. And again, this is just for contrast, just to give it more depth. And since I'm working on contrast a little bit now, I've grabbed some Payne's gray and I'm adding a deeper shadow to the bottom edge of the cliff on the right there, just where the rocks meet the water. Because I noticed that with the sepia that I had put down there earlier, there kind of was no separation between the sepia in the water and the sepia on the rocks. And so the Payne's gray is going to help emphasize this division, and it's going to make that shadow look better. And I'm doing the same thing to the left side. And now I'm watering down some burnt umber because I want to add just a little bit of detail to the cliffs way in the distance back there. With this area, we still want to show somehow that it's a rock formation, right? And so an easy and quick way to do that, since it's in the distance, you don't want to be too detailed and you don't want to have it too dark. And so I dabbed some of the color away with a tissue because it had ended up being too dark. But I'm just adding little random lines, little random strokes, some vertical, some at an angle, just to show that there's some type of rock back there, right? And these little tiny details help this image look even better. You could leave it just like a nice smooth color what it was before, but since I'm being a bit detailed about this whole thing anyway, I'm adding just a tiny bit in the back there to help the image. I've gone back to the sepia, and with the sepia I'm adding some more shadows into the rock work of the cliffs, just some shadows to show that these rocks have cracks and little holes and indentations and whatnot, just all these little minute little details. And once again, I'm back at the rocks in the distance, and I'm adding just a little bit of sepia, just the sepia again, and I'm adding it to the very bottom edge of that cliff to show once again separation from rock and water. And I'm adding also little dabs of that color here and there on the rocks, not too dark. So my paper has now separated from the cutting mat, And it doesn't matter at this point. We're done with our big washes of color. We're working on detail. The paper doesn't need to be attached to anything anymore. So I was looking at the tree trunks and they're very dark. So we want to brighten them up a little bit. We want to make them more visible. So I've grabbed my white gouache from Winsor & Newton. It's permanent white. And I'm putting that gouache on the right side mainly of all the tree trunks and all the branches. And this just helps brighten them up a little bit so that it's not just these dark lines. I also want to add a few branches to the foreground just to break up all that greenery a bit. But because this area is already so dark, I'm going in with the white gouache. And I'm just adding just random lines. Any kind of line that will look like some type of a branch. Now I'm grabbing the leftover browns that are in my palette and I'm adding some of that color over the white so that the white doesn't look too harsh, so that it doesn't stand out more than the greenery does. And this just helps the whole thing look better. It makes it look more realistic. And now I'm done. I'm done with this painting and it was so fun. I have so much fun doing these things. And I'm removing the tape. It's always nice removing the tape. I love this tape. Look how nice and crisp these lines are. Nice and clean. Look how pretty. And I'm gonna sign it, of course. And I'm using my white paint marker because I'm gonna sign it right over all that dark color. I love how this came out. I think it's so pretty. Well, of course, it's my own work. Can I say that about my own work? Oh well, I just did. Ta-da! I hope you enjoyed it. So here comes some close-ups so that you can see everything that I did. I hope you enjoyed it, guys. I hope that you learned a lot of fun techniques here that you can try. Let me know if you have any questions. You can always leave a comment. I'm happy to help. Thanks for being here. Thanks for watching. I wish you all lots of happy creating. Take care, stay hydrated, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!